Deliberate cold exposure has a very powerful effect on the release of dopamine in our brain and body, and that there are a couple of mechanisms by which one might experience increases in testosterone as a consequence of deliberate cold exposure. In other words, the number of calories that you burn per day, and therefore the number of calories that you need to either maintain or to lose weight. I'd like to make a point now that I'm going to make several additional times during today's episode, and that is that temperature is a very potent stimulus for the brain and body. That also means that it carries certain hazards if it's not done correctly. Now, everyone shows up to the table, meaning to protocols, with a different background of health status, and there's simply no way that I can know what your health status is. So anytime you are going to take on a new protocol, that means a behavioral protocol, or a nutritional protocol, or a supplementation protocol, you should absolutely consult a board-certified physician before initiating that protocol. Okay, let's talk about the use of cold for health and performance. A key point when thinking about the use of cold as a tool, and the key point is that you have a baseline level of temperature that is varying, changing across the 24-hour cycle. So any use of deliberate cold exposure is going to be superimposed on that rhythm, that circadian rhythm, meaning that 24-hour rhythm. The basic contour of your circadian rhythm in temperature is that approximately 2 hours before the time you wake up is your so-called temperature minimum. So your temperature minimum is a time within the 24-hour cycle when your body temperature is at its lowest. Okay, so if you normally wake up around 6 a.m., your temperature minimum is probably about 4 a.m. If you normally wake up at about 7 a.m., your temperature minimum is probably about 5 a.m. It's not exactly 2 hours before your wake-up time. It's approximately 2 hours before your wake-up time. Now, as you go from your temperature minimum to the time in which you are going to awake, your temperature is rising slightly. And then at the point where you wake up, your temperature starts to go up more sharply and will continue to go up into the early and sometimes even into the late afternoon. And then sometime in the late afternoon and evening, your temperature will start to decline. And indeed, as you approach sleep, your body temperature will drop by anywhere from 1 to 3 degrees. And in fact, that decrease in core body temperature is important, if not essential, for getting into and staying in deep sleep. Now I just briefly want to touch on thermal regulation at the level of the body and the brain. And this will be very surprising to many of you. And I'm guessing that most of you would think that the best way to cool yourself off would be to drape that towel over your head, maybe your neck, over your torso, that it would feel really, really good and it would cool you off. Well, that's exactly the wrong approach if you want to cool off. And in fact, if you were to use that approach, your body temperature would continue to increase even more, yes, even more, than had you not placed that cold towel on your head or your torso. And here is why. Thermal regulation, meaning your brain and body's ability to regulate your internal core temperature, is somewhat like a thermostat, and that thermostat resides in your brain. And you have such a thermostat as well. It's called the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a small region of brain tissue about over the roof of your mouth and a little bit in front of that. So it's basically right behind your nose and over the roof of your mouth. And it's a collection of neurons. Those neurons have a lot of different functions that include things like the control of aggression, the control of sex behavior, the control of temperature regulation, and so on. The medial preoptic area has connections with the rest of the brain, or areas within the brain, I should say, and with many areas within the body. It receives input from receptors in our skin and inside our body that register temperature, and it acts as the thermostat. So if the surface of your body is made cool, your medial preoptic area will send signals by way of hormones and by way of chemicals that will serve to heat your body up. So what this means is that if you want to cool down, the last thing you want to do is to bring a cold surface of any kind, towel or splashing water, to the majority of your body surface. It might be very, very surprising to you, and you might say, wait, if I want to cool down, I should jump into a cold lake or something of that sort. That's a different thing altogether. What I'll tell you, and we'll get into this in more depth later, is that if you really want to cool down quickly and efficiently, you should leverage particular portals, meaning particular sites on your body where heat can leave your body more readily and where cooling can have a dramatic and fast impact on your core body temperature. It can even save your life if you're going hyperthermic. We're going to talk more about the specific protocols to reduce core body temperature for sake of performance and avoiding hyperthermia later in the episode. Hyperthermia, of course, is a very, very dangerous situation because while your body can drop in core temperature somewhat and still be safe, you can't really increase your body temperature that much before your brain starts to cook and other organs start to cook. And by cook, I mean the cells actually start to die. So you have to be very, very careful with the use of heat. Heat stroke is no joke. People die from heat stroke all the time. You really want to avoid that. One way to avoid that is to cool the appropriate surfaces of your body. And the appropriate surfaces in this case are the upper cheeks, or I would say the upper half of the face, the palms of your hands, and the bottoms of your feet. I've talked about this on the podcast before and in the guest episode with Dr. Craig Heller, my colleague in the biology department at Stanford. But just very briefly, these surfaces, the upper half of the face, the palms of the hands, and the bottoms of the feet are what we call glabrous skin surfaces. Glabrous, glabrous. And those surfaces are unique in that just below them, the vasculature is different than elsewhere in the body. Normally, the passage of blood goes from arteries to capillaries to veins, but just beneath the glabrous skin on the bottoms of the feet, the hands, and the upper half of the face, you have what are called arteriovenous astomoses. These are portals of blood that go directly from arteries to veins, and in doing so, allow the body to dump heat more readily, more quickly. So as it turns out that if you are to cool the palms of the hands, the bottoms of the feet, and the upper half of the face, you can more efficiently reduce core body temperature for sake of offsetting hyperthermia and for improving athletic performance and maybe even cognitive performance. So we will return to the specific protocols for doing that later in the episode. I'll give you a lot of details about how to do that. There are important effects of what we call mindset. And the science of mindset tells us that if we are doing something deliberately and we believe that it's going to be good for us, it actually can lead to a different set of physiological effects than if something is happening to us against our will or without our control. When we talk about deliberate cold exposure, almost always that means getting uncomfortable. And one of the most common questions I get when discussing the use of cold for sake of mental or physical performance, metabolism, etc., is how cold should it be? How cold depends on your cold tolerance, your core metabolism. So I would like you to use this rule of thumb. If you are using deliberate cold exposure, the environment that you place yourself into should place your mind into a state of, whoa, I would really like to get out of this environment, but I can stay in safely. Okay, now that might seem a little bit arbitrary, but let's say you were to get into a warm shower and it would feel really, really nice, and you were to start turning down the warm and turning up the cold. There would be some threshold at which it would feel uncomfortable to you. And if you were to continue to make a little bit colder than that, you would really want to get out of the shower, but you were confident that you could stay in without risking your health. So the most common question I get about deliberate cold exposure is, how cold should the water be? And we've answered that with uncomfortably cold to the point where you want to get out, but you can safely stay in. The second most common question I get about deliberate cold exposure is whether or not cold showers are as good, better, or worse than cold water immersion up to the neck. There are cold protocols that have been tested in peer-reviewed studies that are designed to improve mental performance. They are designed to improve things like resilience or your grittiness or your ability to move through challenge or to regulate your mind and your internal state under conditions of stress. And we can define stress very specifically as times when adrenaline, also called epinephrine, and or norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline, are elevated in your body. Forgive me for the noradrenaline, norepinephrine, adrenaline, epinephrine nomenclature. I didn't make that up. It turns out that every once in a while, scientists disagree. Imagine that. And you'll get multiple scientists naming the same molecule, different things. Okay, so epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing. I will use them interchangeably. Norepinephrine and noradrenaline are the same thing. I will use those terms interchangeably. Noradrenaline and adrenaline are often co-released in the brain and body, so they work as kind of a pair to increase our level of agitation, our level of focus, and our desire and our ability to move. They are often co-released from different sites in the brain and body with dopamine, a molecule that is commonly misunderstood as the molecule of pleasure, but is actually the molecule of motivation, reward, and pursuit. So dopamine, norepinephrine, and noradrenaline tend to be released together under certain conditions. And today you will learn how deliberate cold exposure can be used to cause increases in the release of several, if not all of these, in ways that can improve your levels of attention and your mood. But the key point is that your mental state is shifted when you are exposed to certain forms of cold. And many people use deliberate cold exposure specifically to shift their body state as a way to train their mental state so that they can better cope with stress in real life. And by real life, I mean when life presents stressful events. Now, because of the ways in which deliberate cold exposure can increase this category of chemicals called the catecholamines, that includes dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, it can also be used to elevate mood for long periods of time. And I'm going to discuss a specific protocol that has been shown to increase these chemicals anywhere from 2.5x, so 250%, to as high as 500%, 5 times over baseline. Now, you might be asking whether or not it's a good thing to raise chemicals like norepinephrine and dopamine to such a great degree, whether or not that's healthy for us, whether or not they can harm us. But it turns out that these elevations in norepinephrine and dopamine are very long-lasting in ways that people report feeling vast improvements in mood and vast improvements in levels of cognitive attention and energy. So by my read of the literature, these seem to be healthy increases in our baseline levels of these chemicals. What that all means is that if you are doing your deliberate cold exposure early in the day, you are going to get yet a further increase in core body temperature that would be associated with wakefulness, your ability to be alert that morning or throughout the day, and so on. It also means that if you do your deliberate cold exposure very late in the evening or at night, so 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 9 p.m., and so on, you are going to increase your core body temperature. And if you recall, a decrease in core body temperature of 1 to 3 degrees is not just beneficial, but is necessary in order to get into deep sleep and remain in deep sleep. So the takeaway from this is deliberate cold exposure done properly will increase your core body temperature and make you feel more alert. So if you're doing it early in the day, that's probably terrific, given that most of us want to be alert during the day. However, if you do it too late in the day, evening or night, it can disrupt sleep by way of disrupting your core body temperature. If you are going to do deliberate cold exposure, you are going to increase your core body temperature. And that makes sense if you think about how deliberate cold exposure can increase metabolism by increasing thermogenesis. What that all means is that if you are doing your deliberate cold exposure early in the day, you are going to get yet a further increase in core body temperature that would be associated with wakefulness, your ability to be alert that morning or throughout the day, and so on. It also means that if you do your deliberate cold exposure very late in the evening or at night, so 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 9 p.m., and so on, you are going to increase your core body temperature. And if you recall, a decrease in core body temperature of 1 to 3 degrees is not just beneficial, but is necessary in order to get into deep sleep and remain in deep sleep. So the takeaway from this is deliberate cold exposure done properly will increase your core body temperature and make you feel more alert. So if you're doing it early in the day, that's probably terrific, given that most of us want to be alert during the day. However, if you do it too late in the day, evening or night, it can disrupt sleep by way of disrupting your core body temperature.